Glad you're here. And we started a new series last week that we're actually calling Dare to Believe. And this is a series that really is directed very much toward our own journey as a church. And then we also want to make sure that there's plenty of personal application as well, because what I've come to see to be true is that as God works in our individual lives and in our family lives, He also often works in our church life as well. One of the places we saw that happen in kind of a visible way was several years ago, began to utilize a curriculum called Financial Peace University. And the curriculum Tom was talking about this morning comes out of that. And so begin to encourage people to become debt-free and to live in such a way that their money was not controlling them, but they were controlling money. And over the years, I would say gratefully, we've seen, I think, many people make significant changes in their lives financially, and people pay their houses off and things like that. And so, just really great strides forward and honoring God in that area. So out of that, then, we've purchased this property, of course, and we've built this building, and so, we did borrow money to do that. We didn't go in head over heels, but we did. And but we've made at some point, whenever 2008 came around, we were going through some harder times. We made a decision to not borrow money again as a church, and so that's a part of our values. And so, just as what is good for an individual, what is good for a family, often very times is good for a church as well. So even though I'm going to be talking a fair amount about our church and our journey today, what I want you to also have eyes open to seeing is how God wants to work in your life, in your individual life, in your family's life, as well as in our church's life. And so I'm going to start off with a story that I almost decided not to use, because it may be one of the most used illustrations, at least over the last 50 years, of any illustration that Pastor used. So this is out of my life story. I cannot absolutely verify that this story is true, but it does make a good point. And so bear with me as I tell you the story. If you've heard it before, you can compare it to the times you heard it and whether or not it's similar or dissimilar, but this is how I heard it. There was a gentleman who was a tightrope walker, and he went to the Niagara Falls, and he strung a tightrope across, had his tightrope strung across Niagara Falls. And there was announcements about him doing this, and so great crowd came out to watch him do it. And whenever he was ready to walk across the tightrope, he hollered out to the crowd. He said, "How many of you believe that I can walk across this tightrope and come back again without falling off?" And the crowd just cheered loudly, and they were yaying him on. And so he gets on the tightrope, walks across, comes back. And of course, they're all excited, and they're clapping. And then he pulls out a wheelbarrow, and he says, "How many of you believe I can push this wheelbarrow across and back again?" And I'm cheering him on, whatever. And so he puts the wheelbarrow on he pushes it across, turns around, comes back. Of course, they're cheering wildly. And then he said, "How many of you believe I can push a person across inside the wheelbarrow?" And they're, "Oh, yeah, having a big old time." And so he let it die down. He goes, "So who's going to volunteer?" Well, as you can imagine, I don't think anybody volunteered. So isn't it interesting how we can say we believe a lot of things until you put the test to us? In other words, we can clap about all the things that happened in the Old Testament. We can clap about those stories. We can clap about Jesus' miracles. We can be all excited about all the things God can do until He actually asks us to do it. And then at that point, sometimes we want to go back to the negotiation table and go, "Well, I believe you can do it, God. I just didn't think it was me. That's kind of what happened to Moses. One time he was young and zealous. He's like, I can do it. Killed the guy and buried him. And all of a sudden, then he realizes he's in trouble. He runs and hides, and God goes and finds him. Not that he was lost to God, but he finds him on the backside of the desert and speaks to him through a burning bush and says, "You take all your sandals off. You're on holy ground, and I've got a really important job for you to do." And Moses, man, did he ever backtrack? Goes from, I can do this by myself. I'll kill this one. I'll do what? I'll set my people free. To all of a sudden going, you got the wrong person, and then he starts stuttering. I can't even talk properly. I'm this reason and that reason. Bottom line is, he had gotten comfortable where he was and his place in life. And this felt very, very uncomfortable to him. I would say God is more interested in our calling and our character than he is our comfort. And I wish that those always were the same, but they're not always the same. And generally, about the time we get super comfortable in those, we'll find ourselves with a new challenge set before us. So today we're going to talk about, actually the title of our sermon is the title of our series, and so it's kind of at the very heart of what I want to share with you. Last week we talked about asking for directions, and the essence of it was simply this. If you weren't here with us, was that we have to be willing to find out what God wants for us and in us and through us before we just go plowing ahead into whatever it is. And today, we're going to talk about being willing to actually take steps of faith to believe that what God says, and take him at his word and then act on it. And even though today is more focused on the point of belief, stick with us. Next Sunday, we're going to invite you into an opportunity for prayer. Prayer that is built out of confidence, out of a hope that is certain. And so obviously that means we have to be selective about what we say we're going to pray for in that way, because there are a lot of things we pray about. We don't know God's will, and we don't know his plan exactly. But when we do, we should pray differently. We're going to talk about what that looks like next week. And as a church, collectively, assign ourselves to praying for some very specific things we want to see God do. So let's get started today just by looking at number one at the top of your sheet. If it's beside you there, someplace close. If someone already took it, just ask them if you can have their sheet, please. Go ahead and take it from them. No, I'm just kidding. But there's some empty spaces around. Grab one in front of you or across from you or someplace. Get you a sheet, and let's get started. The first order of business, number one, the first order of business is to clarify what God is calling you to do. Saying dare to believe is one thing, but knowing what it is that God wants us to do is extremely important before we kind of set our teeth into believing him for that. And so I want to share some scriptures with you. All of our scriptures today are from Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is just such an amazing example of somebody who embraced God's call on his life, and it was a call that kind of took him by surprise. It wasn't one he'd been seeking his whole life. It wasn't something he was going out and signing up for. It was one that came to him. And I really believe those are the best calls in life, is whenever God seeks us out. Whenever we're still almost, in a sense, and I don't mean this in a bad way, we're almost trying to avoid it, and yet God confronts us and he comes to us. I'll just have to tell you, in my own journey toward full-time pastoring or ministry, I was called young, and when I was young, I was cool with it. I was just fine with it. It was like, yeah, God, I'll do, whatever. I was like 8 years old, and it was just I never even shared it with anybody for 2 or 3 years, but it was just really clear in my heart. I was all cool with it. About 16, I started not being so all cool with it. And because all of a sudden I started it's like looking me in the eyes, like, coming at me like a train or something. And it really did not sound appealing to me. It didn't seem appealing to me. It wasn't really what felt comfortable to me. So I went through a period of time where I began to try to backtrack on everything I'd said about God calling me to ministry. And I was really young. I mean, that was really do kids really know what they're supposed to do? It never had anything to do with what I was supposed to do in the sense of my ideas. It had to do with what God had spoken into my spirit. So I never could really get away from it. And even though I tried, I looked, even whenever I graduated from college, I never put my name out in a big way. I wasn't trying to I wasn't, but what ended up happening was I almost felt like God drugged me into it. I had come across this, I had to do an internship, and while I was in an internship, I really had an enjoyable experience with the church, and that pastor just wouldn't leave me alone until I finally said, yes, I'll come and I'll work with you and I'll whatever. And so I didn't go, I wasn't resisting in the sense of disobeying God, but I was very hesitant, very, very reticent about, even though I knew my calling was there, it's almost like God had to kind of get a finger in my back and have someone out here kind of pulling me into it. It wasn't something I was chasing down. It wasn't something that I was trying to make happen. And I have to say, that whenever the value to me for that, now 30-some years later, is that whenever I have hard days, whenever you guys give me fit, no, I'm just kidding about that. But anyway, whenever there's times you're going like, man, why am I doing this or whatever, I can't go back to saying this is something that I tried to make happen myself. I have to say, God, you're the one who brought me into it, and I'm here because of you. And so realizing that partnership. And so the first order of business to clarify, what is it God's calling us to do? What is it that he wants us to do? Now, listen here. I'm not going to read all the verses in Nehemiah of these chapters. I've kind of brought it down to size so we can get it in and get out what we need to want to share. And so in Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah's brother and some others had come to him and talked to him, shared with him what was going on in Jerusalem, and it was not a good story. The story was that the gates were burned down, the walls were knocked down for the most part, and that the people there were being overrun by others around, and it was just a terrible, terrible condition. Nehemiah, I think, had hopes that maybe the first remnant had gone back with Ezra, that there had been some rebuilding of the walls or something like that. That didn't happen. But for some reason, when he heard that, and understand, Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the Persian king at this time, and so he's a part of this big kingdom. Even though he's a Jew and from Jerusalem, he was in foreign service, so to speak, to the Persian king, and he was his cupbearer. Very close, obviously, a very close relationship with the king. And so here he is in this place of foreign service, and had been doing this because when he was taken into captivity, and in the midst of this, he hears this, and it just comes all over him. And so here in verse 4, here's where we pick up. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Now, I think, this morning, if I was going to pick a verse to start off with, most people, when you got up this morning, you may have had a rough week last week, or you may have had a great week or whatever, but I think most of the time when we come to start our week off in the place of worship, we're hoping that we get some God inspiration, we get something that kind of gets us pumped up a little bit, and so you come in here, and the very first that I share, first verse I share with you is that this guy mourned and fasted and prayed, and so let's just stop right there. Probably most of you didn't come in to sign up for mourning and fasting and praying. Like maybe the prayer part's okay, but boy, that fasting thing, who likes that? Does that mean going without something? Does that mean not having something I want to have? And mourning, no one likes mourning. We're always glad when we get through a season of mourning. And so I know this morning you didn't come to here and say, well, one of the things I need to do to really be clear about God's will is to mourn and to fast and to pray. But here's what I would say is this. We have to be willing. If God has given us an assignment, and every person here, you individually have an assignment, and that assignment is whatever you're involved in right now, as a husband or as a wife, as a worker, as an employer or as an employee, as a parent or as a child. Everyone in here has specific roles that you play, places that God has put you. And I can tell you that there are going to be some seasons, some moments, sometimes in those tasks, in those jobs, where God is going to call you to be something more than what you thought you signed up to be. He's gonna keep you awake at night sometimes, not because he's mean and doesn't want you to sleep, but because you've taken on this assignment, you've taken on this opportunity, you've taken on this relationship, and out of this, there's gonna be some mourning, there's gonna be some fasting, there's gonna be some praying in order for you to really know and understand what it is God wants you to do. And I believe it's no different for us as a church. And one of the things that, maybe sometimes we don't even emphasize enough is the reality that within our own community, right here, and certainly in the city of Augusta, in our own neighborhoods here, there are a lot of people who are disconnected from God, who do not know God, who do not, and certainly the things we do, we endeavor to build an environment, create a situation where people can come and to find peace with God and to begin to build that relationship. But sometimes I think it actually calls for us to take some extra effort. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about this month is how we may need to take a few extra steps, even in this area of coming before God and kind of pleading before the face of God and saying, God, these are things that you want to do. These are things that you want to accomplish. And we're just simply saying to you, we're signing on to be people who are a part of that process. And so Nehemiah, he was very touched, very impacted, and this was very much a God thing put on him. Just in the same sense, to go back to Moses when he was standing there by the burning bush. Moses was out doing his daily stuff with his sheep and with his, and all of a sudden this encounter that called him to something beyond what he was doing day in and day out. And so when God wants us to do something, he clarifies it for us. In this situation with Nehemiah, I think Nehemiah was just having this conversation. He wanted to hear, but boom, all of a sudden God's Spirit places this on his heart. Now let's go on to verse 10 in chapter 1. And this is that we catch him right in the middle of a prayer here. He's talking about Jerusalem and talking about Jewish people before God. He says, they are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of the king. And so Nehemiah at this point has taken some personal responsibility. He's praying, he's interceding on behalf of Israel to God for the sins that Israel has committed and the reason that they're in the situation they're in. And then he's realizing that God has given him a responsibility, a calling, and so he's asking him, give me favor, please give me favor before the king. And then in verse 8 of going down to chapter 2, and this is in your notes here, but in verse 8, if you have your Bibles, you can see it there. It says, he says this, whenever he went in to see the king, he says, the good hand of my God was upon me. I love that phrase. The good hand of my God was upon me. And so in other words, he prayed for favor. God's rested his hand of favor on him as he went. And there's probably another whole sermon in that. And so I'll save that for another day. But the reality is he sensed and was deeply aware of God's touch upon him, God's hand upon him, God's presence with him as he went before the king. Now, going down to verse 11 and 12 of chapter 2, it says he went to Jerusalem. He had gone through this process. The king had signed papers to send him there with blessing from the other kings. He had sent him there with opportunity to get materials to build the walls. And so he had this blessing from the king. And what Nehemiah was going to do, officially, he was going to be the governor. He wasn't just going there as just someone to show up. He was going there officially in the role as a governor to Jerusalem to take leadership and to take charge in that situation. That's what the king sent him to do. Verse 11, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. I think this is a really, really important piece of what transpires here. Nehemiah obviously had to talk to the king and share with him why he was burdened. And the scripture says that whenever he came before the king and his face was downcast, that the king noticed it right away, because Nehemiah said he had never, ever gone into the king looking down, or like with his spirit down. And so either that means that Nehemiah was truly like a very outgoing, very pleasant, very nice to be around kind of guy who always made people smile and always had a smile on his face, or he had just learned to put always his best foot forward whenever he was in front of the king. I don't know exactly, but my thoughts are, after reading Nehemiah multiple times and studying the book a significant amount of time, is that Nehemiah probably was like an amazing person to be around. And the king obviously had great confidence in him. And understand, it could be a great insult to a king at that time for you to come in with a downcast look on your face. It could be an indication that there's something wrong in the kingdom. Honestly, in that time period, all it took was for a king to get the wrong idea about you, and you would be that your family would be ended up finding a gravesite for you. Okay, it wasn't a real long process oftentimes from being very close to the king to being in your grave, depending on kind of how you looked at him and how you interacted. So Nehemiah said he was afraid whenever he had to go in front of the king, and he couldn't get his countenance to be what it normally was, his cheerful self. And so as a result, he comes in there and he has to let the king know what's going on. King gave him favor, gave him blessing, sent him with that blessing, and now he's in Jerusalem, and he's gone around. He's been there for a few days. He's going around at night, checking everything out, and he still had not told anybody what God had put in his heart to do for Jerusalem. Now, there's 2 or 3 things out of that I want to share with you. One is, God put it in his heart. This wasn't Nehemiah's idea. This wasn't some idea of Nehemiah. This wasn't something Nehemiah just woke up one day, well, hey, I'm gonna run on over to Jerusalem and fix those guys up. I think I got the answer for them. God put it in his heart. And I'm going to tell you, when God puts something in your heart, people can't take it away. They will try. They may not even know they're trying. But they will try to. And there'll be plenty of opportunity for plenty of discouragement. But when God puts something in your heart, when he puts it there, it's something different than just a good idea you have or a good idea I have. It's very, very different. We take different action in comparison. He says this is what God had put in his heart to do to Jerusalem. But the other piece of this is he hadn't told anybody. Now, he did end up telling them, and we'll see about that. But he didn't, at this point, he didn't. The first thing he did when he met these people in Jerusalem, he didn't go, hey, I'm here to fix your problem, you bozos. You guys can't figure this out on your own? What's your problem? I mean, why are you letting this happen? What's wrong here? Are there no leaders around here? What's your deal? He didn't come in and do that. He came in, spent a few days, was looking all around. He went around the whole city at nighttime, checking it out and seeing what was going on. He assessed. He made an assessment. And then out of that assessment, he began to formalize a bit of an idea and a plan. And out of that, then he shared with the people. I think that less talk and more action is always appreciated. I think we all know people. We probably are those people sometimes that do a lot of talk. I'd like to say, you guys, but I'm a talker. I love to talk. And sometimes I'll talk something to death before I ever do anything about it. That's not a good thing. Nehemiah wasn't like that. He didn't just talk something to death. In fact, he didn't even mention to anybody why he was there. He was assessing, and then he was planning, and then he was sharing. So he was taking time to clarify what it was that God was calling him to do. Now, here's a couple things I want to share with you with regard to who we are as a church. And I'd like you to make some personal application to yourself, but I also want to talk about us as a church. When Westtown started, we tried our best to sit down and figure out, before we launched anything, what it was specifically God was calling us to. And so planning a church or starting a church had been something God had had in my heart for a long, long time. But I had been as I mentioned, this gentleman called me on staff. From there, I went and pastored a church in Kansas City for a few years, where we adopted our first set of kids, and then we moved to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. That's where I learned what college football is about. Was in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I always have a fallback team in case Georgia's not doing so well. I just go, hey, I was for Alabama all along anyway, because they seem to win more. And anyway, but that's do we need? I don't think we need to talk football this morning, do we? Let's let that dog lie right there. Let's let that down completely. And I don't know much, but I think I saw a little bit of something, so I'm gonna leave that alone. Because I don't want to win or lose relationships on football. That's not what I'm not about. I'll over to other things, but not that. Okay. So and then from there, I was really in kind of while I was in Tuscaloosa, kind of at a point of going, God, are you ever going to just let me plant a church? And the reason you say, well, why was that a big deal? Well, when I was in college, some guys and I started a church. We didn't know what we were doing, but we ended up starting a church. And our college pastor encouraged us. We were busing a bunch of kids, and we started having a bunch of adults show up on the buses into the campus church. And he said, well, we were bringing them about 30 minutes away. And he said, well, just rent a school down there and meet down there. So we did, and one of us took the youth, one of us took the children, one of us took the adults. And we ended up just sort of having a church develop. But we didn't know what we were doing. We were all working full-time, going to school full-time. And so we were just seeing people get saved, and it was exciting. Later, as I went on down my pathway of ministry, that became a lot clearer to me. Part of the reason that ministry was so exciting was because in the churches that I pastored, they were traditional churches, and people had been there a very long time. And so they were pretty set in their, they're great people, but they were set in their ways. And I didn't feel like I had the right to come in and tell them, well, I know you've been doing this way for, 50 years, but as of today, we're going to do it this way, And so I worked with the best I could within those systems, and it was great experiences, great learning experiences. But I wanted the freedom to be able to do some things that I felt like God had in my heart to do to reach people. So I ended up going from Tuscaloosa to Florida, because I'm going to go back where I started this whole thing to plant a church. And got down there, and every door I was trying to pry open ended up closing on me. And so I ended up spending a year there, a great learning experience at a church called Palm Beach Community Church, and wonderful friends still there in the pastoral team. But from there, came to Augusta. And it was here where God opened the door for me to be able to plant a church. And I was able to walk through that door in Westtown as a result of that. Well, in the meantime, Pastor Greg and I had come into connection, and we decided if we're going to plant a church, we're going to plant it right here in Augusta, and we end up having the blessing of an organization to help sponsor us and support us as we got started, and so we did. But in order to do that, you have to say, why do we exist? Are we just, Augusta has a lot of Baptist churches. It has a lot of churches, even, in fact. Baptist has a lot of Methodist churches, has a lot of Pentecostal churches. I mean, it has churches everywhere. So the question is, why in the world would you start a church? And so we had to really look at that hard. And what we realized was that there was a lot of people, even though this is a very churchy area, a lot of people did not go to church. And there must be some reasons why they didn't go to church. And some of them just because they didn't want to or because they weren't open or whatever. But we also believe that there were people who would go to church maybe if they had an opportunity for something a little bit different than just the typical kind of standard traditional church. So we begin to analyze and carefully look at what would we do differently? Because if we're just going to reproduce what Abilene is doing, well, let's just go join Abilene and let's just do what they're doing. Let's just help them do what they're doing. And so we felt very, very strongly that we should put an emphasis on reaching people who had become disconnected from the church, at least. And even what we found was there's even people disconnected from churches that have not totally disconnected from God. And so we ultimately ended up with a statement like this: to reach spiritually unresolved people and help them become fully devoted followers of Jesus. Now, in that, so it's kind of two pieces. And the first is to reach people who are spiritually unresolved. And the second piece is help them become fully devoted followers of Jesus. Now, in that first piece of it, you're going, well, so for a while we kind of struggled. What does that mean on a Sunday morning to us? Who are we preaching to? Are we preaching only to people who are non-believers? Are we preaching to the believers? And here's how I would summarize, because sometimes people do misunderstand this. 95% of what I say, or anybody else who teaches here on Sunday morning says, is directed to believers. We're on that second piece of it. We're helping you become fully devoted followers of Jesus. We're helping you grow in your Christian life. But how we do that, or how we say that, if you have a person who's been out of church for 10 years or 20 years with you, we believe that we're talking in a practical enough way about those things that would help a Christian to grow, that person would not sit there and go, well, I have no idea. All they did was use theological terms, and all they did was talk about stuff, and they memorized everything, and they repeated it, and all this. I have no idea what they were talking about. We would hope that the person who had been out of church for their whole life, or 5 years, or even 5 months, would come in and say, well, I don't know if I like the church, I don't know if I like the people, but I felt like I got something that I could put to work, put to use this day at work, this next week at work or home. And so our goal is to help people, give people an opportunity. We've watched people who come in very skeptical and take a lengthy amount of time before they cross the line of faith, because we try not to pressure people to do that, but at the same time give them environments and opportunities to do that. And then those who are followers of Christ, we hope to challenge you to a greater life of faith, a greater life of commitment to Christ, being a greater husband, being a greater father, being a greater mother, being a greater wife, and being a greater parent, being a greater employer, being a greater employee, making sure that we're doing the things that God's asked us to do. And so helping us to develop into a holistic follower of Jesus Christ from our head to our toe. And I'm not going to take time to go to the stick man this morning. And everybody goes, thank you. And so our vision is particularly to reach people who have been spiritually unresolved. We have, over the years, been blessed to have about 70% of our congregation that have come into the church, and it's pretty much maintained that percentage from the beginning, to be people who had been out of church anywhere from 6 months to 6 years to much longer than that. But they had been away from church for a season of time, at least in their lives. And so we've seen God help us to reach that element of persons, and that's really what we felt called to. But we do have people who have church background or moved here from wherever, or they, and that they have the same heart that we do, that have joined us, and that's that other 30%. People who are already believers, already Christ followers, who already came in and said, hey, we want to be a part of this. We want to be a part of what God's doing here. And so we always certainly welcome those. One thing we do not do, and we're very intentional about it, even to the point of almost being a bit obnoxious, not meaning to be, but it can be, and that is that if we are not about trying to talk people who go to Wesley United Methodist down here to church into coming to our church. If you have a neighbor and they go to Abilene or they go to Wesley United Methodist or some other church in the area here that's a Bible-believing church or gospel-centered, then the last thing we ever want to do is invite them to come to our church. They're already on their way to heaven. They're already settled into a body of Christ. Encourage them to keep where they are. We don't try to talk people who are already on a pathway of faith out of going on the pathway they're on and come and join us. So we're not about what we would call the sheep shuffle, or getting people to switch congregations around all the time. We're not about that at all. And I try never to be offensive, but if you come to me and you say, hey, I've gone to this church for 10 years or whatever, but I got mad because I didn't get elected to the whatever, and I want to try you guys out. What I'm probably going to do is talk you into going back and having a sit down with your pastor and working through something, rather than going, just bring your disgruntled in here and keep being a disgruntled person for the next 10 years of your life. And anyway, because I'm here to help. We're here to help people. We're not here. We'd love to have 1,000 people here this morning, but we don't want 1,000 people here for the wrong reasons. We're here to grow in the way that God has called us to grow, and to do what it is He's called us to do. And as long as we're faithful to that, we will let the numbers be what the numbers are. And so that's that call, that persistence has been something God's placed on our hearts, and we feel very uncompromising about that. Not because we want to be different for the sake of being different, but we want to be different for the sake of reaching an element of people who maybe have given up on what we would call church as usual. And thank God, there's a whole volume of churches, that have whole choir of churches, so to speak, that have been raising up, even in our area here, certainly around the country and around the world, that are very reflective of what we represent. And so, we're not the only church here doing the kinds of things we're doing. There are many other churches in our kind of area that are as well. And we're grateful for that, because that just means more people who are a bit disillusioned with church as usual will have an opportunity to be a part of something. Now, what is our vision? Our vision is this. Our vision is that we would be a place where love is supreme, where love is a top layer. And in other words, if you don't get anything else from here, you would feel like people love you. And if you are newer to the church and you don't feel like anybody loves you, come and let me know who you've talked to, because I'm going to bop them. No, I'm just kidding. But we're going to punch people and say, you better love somebody, huh? The deal is, my deal is this: church should be the place you feel the most love of any place in the world. And you say, well, if you just love everybody, you're going to compromise truth. Loving people and compromising truth are very opposite kinds of things here. Because I think if there was anything that Jesus commanded His people to do, was love one another, create an atmosphere of love in the body of Christ. In fact, people will know you're a follower of Christ because of how you love each other. And you say, well, that doesn't mean loving the stranger who comes in the door. Well, it certainly, Jesus got accused of being a friend of sinners. And here's what it comes down to for me. If I'm accused of something ever, I want to be accused of something Jesus was accused of. Okay, I don't want to be accused of something the Pharisees were accused of. I want to be accused of something Jesus was accused of. And He was accused of being a friend of sinners. And so I want us to be a church who's a friend of sinners, a friend of people. And you go, well, who's that mean? That means everybody. So that means I'm everybody's friend. You better be my friend, because we're all sinners. But we're talking about particularly in the sense of sinners who don't give a rip. Sinners who don't care, who aren't trying to please God in any kind of way, aren't trying to kind of up their score, so to speak, in their righteousness. They're not moving forward. The big bad boys, the rough and tumble, the people who are openly whatever it is. God's called us to love those people. Jesus loved those people. In fact, here's what He said. He said two things that really, really I can never get away from as a person, but also as a pastor. And that is, after He had been to the home of Zacchaeus, He made this statement. He said, the Son of Man has come to seek and to save those who are lost. And you say, sometimes I have people say, well, is this a seeker church? In this way, it's a seeker church. We're seeking those who are lost. We're seeking those who are lost. Yes, we are. In that sense, we're seeking after those who are lost, because that's what Jesus said He came to do. That was a mission statement. If you would ever have a summary mission statement Jesus had, He came to seek and to save those who are lost. And so his thrust was that. And then He also made a statement like this, and that was that well people don't need a doctor. And so here's what I would say: if someone doesn't believe they need any help, if someone doesn't believe they need any solutions in their life, you can't help them. The only people you can help are someone who believes they need help. And you know, for most of us guys, guys aren't typically the kind of people who love to go hang out at doctor's offices and hospital. I don't mean women do either, but women are just smarter than men, okay? And so they're like, hey, I think we need to go to the hospital on this. Or, you know, tell your husband he's having chest pains for 2 days. You probably ought to go to the emergency room. You know, I'm a big, tough guy. Those are the kind of people who die of heart attacks, you know, big, tough guys. So, you know, we have all these little images and ideas, and we resist things. But here's what I want to tell you. There comes a point in all of our lives where we realize we need help. And at the point we realize we need help, that's when God can help us. That's when a church can help somebody. Why is it that we have something like Celebrate Recovery here every Thursday night? Why is it that we're so open to having something like Financial Peace University? Why is it that we're so open to having something like divorce care? You know, we had one of our teenagers ask his dad, young teenager, ask his dad after we announced we're having divorce care. He said, Dad, does that mean we're encouraging people to get divorces? And say, no. But people do get divorces, and people that are going through divorces do need help. And so we're here to help. We want to be an answer to the question. We want to be a solution to the problem. We want to be a hand to the needy. We want to say, you know, what is it that you're struggling with? We are here to help if at all possible. And so we do that in two ways. One is we minister to each other, minister to those who are hurting within our community, who may not even be a part of our congregation at this point. They come to one of those meetings, and yet what we find is oftentimes God uses that as a pathway either toward a relationship with God or encouraging them back into a relationship with God, reconnecting with Him. Or even just finding their way even into a church that they had left 5 years ago or something that they get reconnected with. And so we're out to build the kingdom, draw people to the kingdom, and build the kingdom. And sometimes it happens right within our four walls, and we're grateful for that. But we're also grateful when he uses us to point someone in the right direction as well. So what is our vision? Our vision is love. We want an atmosphere of love. It says we love you, we care about you, not just because we think we should, but because we really do. How can we do that? The only way we can do that is to love God. So we have to be people who love God. And our desire is that we would be a congregation full of people who love God and just in amazing ways, just love Him, just absolutely have a relationship with Him that is love, understanding how much God loves us. We love Him and we love other people. And then we want everyone to have connection with God, be connected and connected with each other. We believe that if you're in a love relationship with God, you're connected up with other people, you will grow. And if you grow, what will happen is you will become a life-giving person. If your roots are grounded in love and connection to God and to other people, the right people, fruit will happen in your life. When that fruit happens, it's life-giving. There will be people in your workplace who will want to be around you. There'll be people in your home who want to be around you. You say, well, nobody likes me at work. Well, there's probably a reason. I'm not going to suppose what that reason is, but it's probably not a real good reason, okay? So you probably ought to go home and look in the mirror a little bit and have a little conversation. Say, when I come home, nobody comes and greets me at the door, you know. You need to get a dog then, because dogs will love you when everybody else doesn't, all right? So go ahead and get you a dog because you're not batting too good. Anyway, sorry about that. Where's the rabbit, Nathan? I don't know if it's rabbit trail or not, really, though. So there are four things that we really say we want to focus on and emphasize here, and that is Sunday morning worship. Get your week started right. Get the beginning of your week started in the presence of God, in a place where God's going to be lifted up, He's going to be honored, and kick it off right. And we're so grateful you're here this morning to help us do that. And so we believe Sunday morning worship is just like, you know, if you're going to take a spiritual pill, you need to take that pill. So there'll be some Sundays you're here and you'll scratch your head and leave and go, why was I there? But there'll be so many of those that God will give you something. You need to start your week off right with God. Number two, growth track. And that's the opportunity once, you know, we offer it every month to get in and find some things out about who we are, find some things about yourself, and then at the end of the day, end up doing what the next one is and being on a serving team or a dream team where you're participating and helping to do ministry. And then the fourth area we focus is small groups and making sure that people are connected to each other in a small group setting. And so those are kind of the guiding boundaries of what we try to accomplish or trying to accomplish and what God has called us to do. Now, number 2 is review how God has been faithful up to this point. And I believe this is so important in our individual lives and as a church as well. Sometimes, I was talking last week about the mountains and the mountain range that I identified in 2010 and how God has moved some of those mountains and others are partly moved and others are still standing. And it's really, I find it really, really helpful to me when I'm praying over those mountains to go back and review how God worked in the removal of mountains. And what that does is that gives me great courage and boldness in the prayers that I'm praying for the mountains that are in front of me right now. And so reviewing how God has been faithful is very important. If you go back and look across your life on an individual basis and see how God has worked, it would just encourage the daylights out of you today. If you look at your family, your marriage, your family, and you see the ways that God has worked, it can be great encouragement. And even through hard times, I don't mean everything's been great for you or everything's gone the way you wanted it to, but even through the very, very hardest of times, to see how God brought you through those hard times, brought you through those difficult places, and find yourself encouraged. Now, let's look at verse 17 of chapter 2, of 17 and 18. It says, "Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem." Now, if he'd have said that and stopped there, that would have been great. I mean, he's like, okay, I'm acknowledging what's going on here. He put himself in it. The trouble we are in. He didn't go, see the trouble you guys are in? Because see, Nehemiah was in a very favored position, even though he was in foreign service, and even though he was captive in a sense, he had been taken as a captive, and he was hanging out with the king. Okay, whatever the king ate, he was eating because he ate it before the king as a cupbearer, and he drank it before the king. So he was getting to taste it when it was freshest off the grill. I mean, he got to taste it before the king did. I mean, this guy was sitting in a pretty cushy spot. Scary, be that close to the king, do something wrong, but in many ways, very cushy. But he comes down here to these people whose lives are totally destroyed. And he identifies, he says, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall. Now look, here's what he says. We will no longer be in disgrace. Continuing to give a statement of faith here. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God. He likes to express this as God's hand. The gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Now, here's what he did. He walked back through and explained to them what had happened from the time he heard about the walls of Jerusalem and how he had gone before the king, how he had asked the king for papers for the different provinces for the governors to give him passage through, and how the king had sent him with military forces to get him through those areas, how he sent him with papers for him to be able to get wood so they could rebuild the things that they needed to rebuild from the king's forest. What an amazing, amazing miracle after miracle after miracle that God performed to get him to where he was today. Why was that so important for him to tell that to them? So that they knew and understood he just didn't wake up yesterday and get it in his head that he had this really good idea. He's going to come over here and straighten these guys out and help them. That he had been burdened by the Spirit of God. He had gotten up in obedience to that and gone before the king after thoughtful prayer and fasting and mourning about their situation. So his heart was attuned to their plight. And he comes and he said, this is all the different ways that God has opened the doors for me to be here now. And now I stand here with authority in my hand from the king. I stand here with material capability in my hand to make things happen. And God has led me every step of the way. No wonder These people are going, man, let's just start building. They've been sitting here doing nothing. They've been sitting here being run over. They're going, let's do it. And they got up and actually started doing the work right then and there. Now, I want to walk you through just a little bit of our own journey as a church. Pastor Greg, if we had more time, sometime we'll try to do this together because he remembers things I don't remember, and I remember things maybe he not. But we have some. So Pastor Greg's family and our family were the ones who said we're going to start this church called Westtown, and we're going to do this thing with God's help, and felt His calling on our lives. So Greg and I, we get in one of the cars, and we're driving around looking for some place to meet. We thought, we ought to at least have an office. We ought to have some kind of a hole in the wall someplace. So we're over in Martinez area. We found some storefronts that had, for lease on them or whatever. So we called the number. We're sitting out front. We called the number. And the guy says he'd meet us over there. So he comes over, and we're going in, and it's just like, it wasn't as much space as there is on the stage up here, okay? And we're going, could we get 20 people in there? Could we get, I don't know. If we put an office in there, we might get 5 people in there. We were just, and we're talking and all this stuff, and the guy's standing there, and he goes, well, what are you going to put in? What would you put in here? We said, well, we're starting a church. And he said, really? He said, well, I rent to a church. And we said, well, that's nice. But anyway, he said, they bought some property, and they're moving. So he goes, come and I'll show you their place. So we go over there. Do we have a picture of the place? I don't know if we have a picture or not. We talked about it, and then okay, so we don't. But we'll show you a picture sometime because it makes a point. And the point is, it was a pretty awful looking building, to be honest with you. It was off blue. I don't know what you couldn't call it baby blue. It was like faded out blue. And when you walked in the door, there was this like hallway there, and the ceiling bellied down like this. Now it was, and I'm not the tallest guy in the world, but I'm on the short side of tall, and it was like this much above my head when you walked straight under that belly thing there. It looked like it rained the day before and it was going to cave in or something, But we went in there and it's like, wow, there's kind of quite a bit of space in here. At least we have space. We don't have looks. We don't have appeal. We don't have anything, but we have some space. So we ended up saying yes, we'd do it. And Greg had to go ahead and put his first tithe check in so that we could put a down payment on the place. And so we rented it. We just like, yeah, and so we did. And thinking back on it, I think that was I think we did a year's lease or something. There's like, I don't know what was going to happen if nobody showed up. But anyway, so we did. Then and the guy said, you know what? He said, when did you want to meet? And we told him the last Sunday of June, we wanted to have kind of a soft opening, just anybody we could, gather in or whatever. And he goes, well, that's the church's last Sunday here. But they're not going to meet here that Sunday. They're actually going to go to their new place and do kind of what you're talking about doing. And they're not moving their sound system or anything. Do you want me to check and see if you can use it? Yeah. So he calls them. Sure enough, we could use it. And but the problem was they were taking all their chairs. So we said, well, kind of hate to have them in this building and not have any place to sit. So that might be too much. So Greg was a National Guard at that point. He got a hold of them. We borrowed the most beat up metal chairs I've ever seen in my entire life. It's all the option we had. So we went and got them. We were piling them up in our cars, and we just kept piling them in. Say, well, how many people do you think we have? I have no idea. I had a few people call me and ask whatever. I think we have someone's going to show up. We don't know who. We don't know why exactly. So we got, I think, about 80 chairs or something, and we put them out there, and I think we had about 55 people end up showing up that Sunday. And we were borrowing the other church's sound system, so you can imagine what we sounded like. And I have to tell you, back then, when we started, I was the lead voice in the band. So you can just figure that out. It was Vanjie on a little, kind of keyboard. Greg at that point wouldn't play his guitar and sing at the same time. And so we're like, wait, man, what do you know, anyway, it was just, and Dwayne very, very early off at least came in there and helped us. So it was pretty amazing. I mean, and so here's the amazing thing. We had 50-some people that first Sunday. Now, that was like, you could just say, well, something new's going on, something new's happening, people might come and kind of see how bad it is. But I'll tell you, so they can go around and tell everybody, hey, over there, and we used to kind of joke, we keep the snakes out back there, so don't go too far out. No, I'm just kidding. But that was a joke, but because it looked that bad, and kind of looked bad. Unfortunately, it was in town. Well, here was what really blew us away. When people showed up the second Sunday, after the second Sunday, Greg and I were like, actually, people came back. That was what really shocked us, was that people came back. And we were like, I don't know. I mean, maybe it will work. Maybe this will, maybe we actually grow a church. So thank God, some very faithful people showed in those very first days, and have some of them, many people have in that set have moved to other parts, but we still have a remnant of those people right here today who often help shoulder the load over these last years. Been what I would call the rocks, the foundation in this endeavor. And God pulled together kind of a motley crew of us, and now a little over 19 years, here we are. But let me just mention a couple other things. There was a phenomenal step of faith for us, because even though we did have some financial backing from an organization, that church planting organization, we still knew that was going to run out very quickly, and it wasn't really enough to sustain us. But we went ahead and stepped in. We moved over to Augusta Prep for our Sunday morning services 2 years into the process, so that we didn't have to have people come in and scrape their head on on this. They could, once they met us over to Augusta Prep, they could come over to the office and visit us if they wanted to. But and so then we were in two different places there. In 2002, we purchased this property. And when we bought this property, this building was not here, of course, and those buildings were, but those buildings had boards on all the windows. And so I remember we met out here with a group of people after the whole miracle of how we were not the top bidders for this property. But within a week, God had helped the ones in front of us to decline or do something, couldn't come up with the money or whatever. And so it came to us. And there were people in our midst who had greater faith than I did, who saw that coming and I didn't. And so we gathered over here after we knew we were buying the property, and had a prayer circle out here by this little building next door. Boards all over all the windows because there had been vandalism. And stepped out in faith, started in 2003, January 2003, meeting in those buildings, and had 2 services. And we had a much nicer ceiling in the foyer over here. But if you go walk in that foyer, one of the things you will notice is there's not a lot of space. So we didn't have much space, and so we made do, and raised funds to build this building. And on January of 2007, 8.5 years ago, we had our first service in this building. And then, as most of you know, about 1.5 years ago, we started something we called Operation Advance. And Operation Advance was for us to take some steps forward again. And in that, what we have done so far with that, number one, let me just tell you, we ended up having a goal of $500,000 in order to do several different things. We were blown away when we came in for our commitment dinner on the Sunday and found out that $623,000 had been committed. And so, to date, the campaign continues on through the end of December, and to date we have received $576,000 of those funds, and I can only say to God be the glory for that. And I would like to say thank you for your faithfulness and how God has worked mightily. We did a kind of a little bit of an evaluation as to what mattered the most out of the projects we had. And the 2 things that mattered the most was for us to hire a part-time youth, our children's pastor, and a full-time youth pastor. And I'm glad to report to you today that those things have been filled. We've had a part-time youth pastor now for a little over a year. Vanjie, my wife, is doing that job, and we're really grateful for how that's going. And a little over 6 weeks ago, we hired Nathan and Kelsey to be here full-time as youth pastor and wife, and we are thrilled. We believe God's hand has been involved in this, very much so. And then several other smaller things on the list have happened as well. We sat down and we have revisited, actually pretty early on, as to what direction, what part of this and how we want to do it. You know, one of the things, we want to fix the driveway out there, we want to fix the parking lot and all that. But you'll have to come back next week to find out kind of how we realigned our Operation Advance and what it is that we're going to do. We feel like God has clearly asked us to move forward with and do. And so you'll have to come back next Sunday to hear that, because first of all, I'm out of time, number one, and number two, that's what I'm planning on sharing anyway. So let me close with looking at number three and what daring to believe entails. And verse 4, I'm just going to read through these verses and point a couple things out and then say in prayer. After I looked things over, assessment, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid. If you're going to have strong faith, you have to assess what it is God wants me to do, assess what it is, and come up with a plan, and then face your fears. Face your fears. And it says, remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. There's only one reason why any of us should ever be willing to attack any mountain. And that's because of who God is, not because of who we are. God says he specializes in doing what's impossible with man. And what I have seen over the years is at times whenever I felt overwhelmed, I felt fearful about things in the future, God's reminded me this is not about you and it's not about your capabilities. It's about who I am and it's about what I want to accomplish and do on this earth and advance my kingdom. So don't ever forget that. And I'll tell you, I resisted do Operation Advance. I felt God tugging me for a long time, months before we even talked about it to somebody, because, and the thing that turned my heart on that was whenever God squarely said to my spirit, I didn't hear a voice, but in my spirit, this thought became so crystal clear, I knew it was from God, and that was the risk of doing something that, like, I'm asking you to do. I'm sorry, let me go back. The risk of not doing what I'm asking you to do is way greater than doing what I'm asking you to do. And whenever I understand that clearly from God, then it really doesn't matter whether we fail in people's eyes or not, or anything else. We're going to do what God has called us to do. We're going to do at least in order to be his conduit. So we focus on who God is. And remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Remember how great he is. He's the God who does the impossible. And then fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. And this just says, you know, one of the things that we believe one of the things that we're pressing forward with children's ministry, with youth ministry is this. We believe God's called us to fight for our kids, to fight for our families, to fight for them to be people who have strong faith, who will raise up another generation, who will be difference makers in our world. And so that's what God has called us to do. And then going down to verse 3 of chapter 6, we're jumping down to chapter 6. So I sent messengers to them. These people were trying to stop him from the work. He goes, I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it? Do you ever feel distracted from the most important things in your life? You ever come home from work as a dad and your son says, can you throw the football with me? And you go, I've had a hard day. I just want to get my feet propped up. I just want to get the paper. Nehemiah knew what was the most important thing. And that's what he did. And we have to be able to discern what's the most important thing and do it. And then verse 9, they were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed Now strengthen my hands. Give me the physical strength I need to do what it is you called me to do. And then verse 11, emotional strength. I said, should a man like me run away? Someone was talking to him to go running in the temple and hiding. He goes, why should I run away? Or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. He had physical strength, he had spiritual strength, he had emotional strength. And I'm going to tell you, it takes all of those for us to be what God wants us to be in our families, in our homes, and in our church. And I'm going to ask all of us to believe that God will do that. He'll give us the strength in those areas particularly we need as we go forward. The last two verses, two verses. They read from the book of the law of God, making it clear and giving them meaning so that the people understood what was read. We get to stay focused on the main focus, which is God and His word and His glory. This day is holy to our Lord. Do not grieve, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. I will tell you, there is nothing that will energize me to do what God's asked me to do more than the awareness of His presence in my life. And so we need to stay refreshed in His presence so that the joy of the Lord is our strength.